By 2026, India's standing in the World Press Freedom Index hit its lowest point in 25 years. This chart tracks the World Press Freedom Index, where India now ranks 157th, placing it below active conflict zones like Palestine. The ranking is driven by a very serious legal environment score, reflecting intensified judicial harassment against independent newsrooms. However, these objective global metrics stand in direct contrast to how the Indian public actually views their own media. A 2025 Pew Research Center survey found that 80% of Indians believe their media is free from government intervention, one of the highest figures in the 35 countries surveyed. This press freedom gap suggests the public is navigating a manufactured reality, one that effectively masks the systemic collapse of journalistic independence. This perception gap represents a deliberate systemic outcome of the modern broadcast landscape. Scholars define this condition as information disorder, where the boundaries between authentic journalism, state propaganda, and corporate interest have become porous. In this ecosystem, truth is often negotiable, predicated on ideological alignment rather than factual density. The system utilizes specific narrative cues to align public belief with state interests, often normalizing viewpoints that favor the current political order. To understand the mechanics behind this paradox, we have to look at the structural transformations in media ownership and revenue models that occurred between 2024 and 2026. Analyzing this crisis requires looking past daily news headlines and examining the underlying economic drivers of media capture. The 2024-2026 transformation is built on intense ownership concentration. Following the economic liberalization of the 1990s, the Indian media industry moved rapidly towards consolidation. Today, the landscape is dominated by a few elite corporate conglomerates that have transformed news outlets into advertising-driven businesses. Reliance Industries controls over 70 television channels and roughly 70. India currently lacks a cohesive framework to regulate cross-media ownership, allowing national and regional players to control more than half of the viewership in their respective markets. Within this corporate architecture, news outlets act less as public watchdogs and more as public relations tools for their parent conglomerates. While ownership defines the boundaries, the daily driver of content is the television rating point, or TRP system. This metric is the central pillar of the news business because higher TRPs translate directly into increased advertising revenue. To maintain these ratings, broadcasters are forced to prioritize engaging, controversial content over substantive, balanced reporting. This is the strategic tabloidization of news, over-reporting on crime, cinema, and religious controversies, while essential issues like rural distress or healthcare are ignored. Broadcast style has evolved into sensational TV, a format that replaces journalism with what observers call a theater of aggression. Networks command audience attention through high-decibel yelling, heavily biased framing, and the persistent use of triggering video game-style graphics. News has become a genre of infotainment, where drama is used to spice up stories and compete for market share. The TRP trap ensures that the most profitable broadcasts are inherently the most inflammatory, effectively decoupling financial success from journalistic truth. Broadcasters capture these TRPs through the construction of an emotional architecture, a deliberate framing of stories to provoke specific feelings. Research uses the Emotional Accountability Index, or EAI, to quantify the use of these effective cues across different platforms. This chart compares EAI scores. National TV news displays a high emotional intensity of 0.72, alongside the lowest factual density, relying on anger and fear. Conversely, independent digital portals score 0.76, relying primarily on analytical and logical framing. Presenting news with high emotional intensity limits a viewer's ability to process facts critically or engage in intellectual discussion. Data shows a strong negative correlation of -0.71 between an outlet's use of emotional framing and its dependence on government-linked ad revenue. Emotional manipulation functions as a calculated, highly monetized variable, a feature of the system rather than a byproduct of poor reporting. The real-world consequence of this emotional architecture was demonstrated during the India-Pakistan media crisis of May 2025. Mainstream television was flooded with misinformation, transforming newsrooms into what observers called a national embarrassment. This table tracks specific false reports. Zee News claimed the capture of Islamabad, while India TV reported the destruction of the Karachi port. Channels even used video game footage and clips from unrelated conflicts in Gaza as live evidence of Indian strikes. Fact-checkers classified these broadcasts as deliberate information warfare, directed by media houses against their own audience. Anchors celebrated in studios under the guise of big breaking news, attempting to desensitize the public to the gravity of a potential nuclear conflict. The Ministry of Home Affairs eventually issued an advisory warning that such dramatization compromised emergency responses. The May 2025 crisis proved that when incentivized by TRPs and corporate alignment, the system is designed to voluntarily abandon reality. This broadcast disinformation spreads through encrypted platforms, specifically reaching India's 535 million WhatsApp users. Within trusted networks of family and friends, a forward culture allows fake news to spread rapidly without critical evaluation. Algorithmic curation deepens these echo chambers, fostering hostility toward opposing views and making factual corrections increasingly ineffective. Oversight has largely failed to address this, due to the regulatory gap between the statutory but weak Press Council of India and the voluntary NBDSA. This timeline shows that the NBDSA's punitive actions, such as small monetary fines, often arrive nearly a year after the offensive programs have aired. These minor penalties act merely as operational costs for broadcasters, ensuring that generating inflammatory content remains highly profitable. The final element of this ecosystem is the Broadcasting Services Regulation Bill, introduced in 2024-2025. This legislation aims to classify independent YouTubers and digital creators as digital news broadcasters, subjecting them to state-defined standards. This aggressive move threatens to place all independent analytical journalism firmly under the exact same rigid regulatory framework currently governing traditional television. The erosion of a common ground fragments communities, making national problem-solving nearly impossible, while leaving the public vulnerable to communal tensions. Addressing this requires strengthening self-regulatory bodies, enforcing strict regulations on cross-media ownership, and protecting digital freedom. Without fundamental reform of these economic and structural drivers, Indian democracy remains captive to a profitable delusion, one that explains why 80% of the public believes they are free, while the space for independent journalism disappears.